There are moments when the universe holds its breath, waiting for someone to remember who they really are. In the marble-lined bathrooms of Chicago's most expensive hotel, where millionaires wash their hands with soap that costs more than minimum wage, a cleaning woman hummed Bizet while scrubbing toilets. She had no idea that tonight, her forgotten voice would shatter someone's champagne glass and change everything. The Palmer House Hilton's grand ballroom buzzed with the kind of energy that only comes when European money meets American ambition. It was 8:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in October, and Larissa Volkov pushed her yellow cart through the service corridor, her rubber gloves squeaking against the handle. The cart's wheels had developed that familiar wobble over 3 years of late shifts, and the sound echoed off the marble walls like a metronome marking time she'd rather forget. She moved through the hotel like a ghost in navy blue uniform, invisible to the guests who swept past in designer suits and cocktail dresses. A woman in Louboutin heels nearly knocked her over rushing to the elevator, not even glancing back. Larissa steadied herself against the wall, watching the woman disappear behind golden doors. "Watch where you're going," muttered a young executive as he sidestepped her cart. His tone carried that particular brand of casual dismissal reserved for service workers, as if she were furniture that had inconveniently placed itself in his path. Larissa's fingers tightened around her cleaning cloth, but she said nothing. In the executive washroom on the 15th floor, she worked methodically, the familiar rhythm of spray, wipe, rinse, helping to quiet the voices in her head. A forgotten program from the Chicago Lyric Opera peeked out from under some papers on the counter, and she quickly tucked it away, her throat tightening. 10 years ago, she had auditioned for their Young Artist program. The rejection letter was probably still in a box somewhere in her studio apartment. She carried a silver compass her grandmother had given her in St. Petersburg, now hanging from her cleaning cart next to the disinfectant bottles. "For when you forget which direction is home," her babushka had said. These days, home felt like a concept from another life. Brad Morrison, the hotel's assistant food and beverage manager, appeared in the doorway wearing his standard expression of administrative irritation. He was 32, had an MBA from Northwestern, and treated the cleaning staff like malfunctioning equipment that occasionally needed verbal troubleshooting. "Larissa, you're behind schedule. The European delegation's reception is moving to the Gold Coast room, and those bathrooms better be spotless." When an elderly French gentleman dropped his iPhone near the service elevator, Larissa didn't hesitate. She picked it up and hurried after him, catching him just as he entered the reception. "Excusez-moi, monsieur," she said, extending the phone. "Vous avez oublié votre téléphone." The man turned, surprise flickering across his weathered features. "Ah, merci beaucoup, mademoiselle. Vous parlez français?" Before she could answer, Brad appeared at her elbow, his smile sharp with embarrassment. "Sorry about that, Monsieur Dubois. Our cleaning staff sometimes oversteps." His eyes found Larissa's. "Back to work." The French gentleman, Henri Dubois, studied her face for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression, like a memory trying to surface. But then another guest claimed his attention, and the moment passed. Larissa returned to her cart, her cheeks burning. The next evening, Brad summoned her to his office without explanation. She stood in the doorway, still wearing her rubber gloves, while he finished a phone call about wine inventory. When he finally looked up, his expression was unreadable. "The French guy asked about you," he said. "Wants to know if you're available for some kind of translation work during their meetings." He leaned back in his chair. "I told him you're just cleaning staff, but he was insistent." Larissa felt something flutter in her chest, dangerous and familiar. Hope had a way of sneaking up on her when she least expected it, and she'd learned not to trust it. "I just returned his phone." "Yeah, well, don't get any ideas. You're here to clean, not to play interpreter." Brad's phone buzzed, and he was already reaching for it. "Just, if he asks again, be polite, but stay in your lane." The other cleaning women whispered about her during their break. Rosa, who'd worked at the Palmer House for 15 years, shook her head. "Girl, you need to be careful. These rich people, they play games. They build you up just to watch you fall." "But what if it's real?" asked Maria, the newest member of their crew. She was barely 21, still believed in fairy tales disguised as overtime opportunities. "Ain't nothing real about it," Rosa said, unwrapping her sandwich. "I've seen girls get their hopes up before. Always ends the same way." Larissa listened in silence, memories she'd buried threatening to surface. She thought about her father, who'd been a literature professor in St. Petersburg before the economy collapsed. How he'd cleaned office buildings in Detroit while sending out CVS to universities that never wrote back. How he'd died still wearing his old professor's glasses, still believing that someday someone would remember what he'd once been. 2 days later, she was restocking toilet paper in the Gold Coast Room's powder room when she heard raised voices outside. Through the cracked door, she could see Henri Dubois arguing with a younger French businessman who was obviously drunk and obviously angry. Tu es un imbécile, the young man slurred. This whole deal is a waste of time. These Americans, they don't understand subtlety. Henri's voice was steady but strained. Pierre, you need to calm down. The senators are watching. Let them watch, Pierre laughed bitterly. Let them see what French patience looks like. Without thinking, Larissa stepped out of the powder room. The words came naturally, in the fluid French her grandmother had insisted she master. Monsieur, perhaps some coffee? There's a quiet alcove down the hall where you could collect yourself. Both men turned to stare at her. Pierre's eyes were bloodshot, angry. Who is this person? Why is the help speaking French? Henri moved slightly, positioning himself between Pierre and Larissa. She was being helpful. I don't need help from the cleaning lady, Pierre spat, but he was already moving toward the alcove Larissa had indicated. When Pierre was gone, Henri studied her face again. This time, the memory seemed closer to the surface. Your accent, he said quietly. It's very educated. Larissa's hands found her grandmother's compass hanging from her belt next to the spray bottles. My grandmother taught me. Your grandmother, Henri repeated slowly. And where was she from? St. Petersburg. She used to say that language was the only treasure that couldn't be stolen. Something clicked in Henri's eyes. Mon Dieu, he whispered. The competition. Paris, 2014. You sang Carmen. The world seemed to stop spinning. Larissa stared at him, her cleaning cloth forgotten in her hands. How do you... I was on the jury. You were 16, maybe 17. You sang L'amour est un oiseau rebelle, like you'd lived every word. Henri's voice carried a weight of regret. You won second place. I voted for you to win first. The memory hit her like a physical blow. The bright lights of the conservatory stage, her mother crying in the audience, the promise of a scholarship to study in France. Then, her mother's cancer diagnosis 2 weeks later, the medical bills, the choice between dreams and survival. I remember, she said, her voice barely audible. What happened? Why are you here? Before she could answer, Brad's voice cut through the moment like a blade. Larissa, what the hell are you doing? Get back to work. Henri turned to face him, and something in the older man's posture made Brad take a step back. I was just asking her about her background. Her background is cleaning toilets and staying out of guests' way, Brad said, but his voice had lost some of its authority. That night, Larissa stood in her studio apartment, staring at a box she hadn't opened in 5 years. Inside were programs from her high school performances, letters from music schools, photos of herself in costume as Mimi, as Violetta, as Carmen herself. She lifted out a CD of her senior recital, her 18-year-old voice frozen in time. She'd told herself the dreams were childish, that adult life required different priorities. But holding the CD, she remembered the feeling of stepping into a character, of letting music flow through her like water through cupped hands. The next day, Henri sought her out during her lunch break. He found her in the employee cafeteria, picking at a turkey sandwich while reading a worn paperback copy of Les Misérables in French. I've been thinking about our conversation, he said, sliding into the plastic chair across from her. Larissa closed the book, suddenly self-conscious. Around them, other hotel employees were stealing glances, whispering behind their hands. I made some calls, Henri continued. The Chicago Lyric Opera is holding auditions next month for their chorus. It's not the leads, but it's a start. Monsieur, I appreciate your kindness, but nothing. You have a gift. Gifts like yours don't disappear. They just hibernate. Rosa appeared at their table, her expression worried. Larissa, honey, Brad's looking for you, and he don't look happy. Henri stood as Brad approached, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Okay, this stops now. Larissa, you're here to work, not to socialize with the guests. Actually, Henri said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard, I was asking Miss Volkov about her availability for some translation work during our remaining meetings. She's not qualified for that kind of work. I think I'm qualified to determine what qualifications I require. Henry's smile was pleasant and absolutely final. Brad's jaw worked soundlessly for a moment. Then he pointed at Larissa. Fine, but on your own time. And if this interferes with your cleaning duties, you're gone. That evening, the hotel hosted a farewell dinner for the French delegation. Larissa worked the late shift, emptying trash bins and wiping down surfaces while the party continued in the grand ballroom. Through the service doors, she could hear laughter, clinking glasses, the tinkling of a piano. She was cleaning the bathroom outside the ballroom when she heard Pierre's voice again, louder and more belligerent than before. This whole trip has been a joke. These Americans, they have no culture, no sophistication. They wouldn't recognize art if it bit them on their fat asses. A few guests laughed uncomfortably. Someone tried to change the subject, but Pierre was just getting started. And that hotel staff! Did you see that pathetic cleaning woman trying to speak French? Probably learned it from Google Translate. The piano had stopped playing. In the silence, Larissa could hear her own heartbeat. Some people, Pierre continued, should know their place in the world. Larissa found herself standing in the ballroom doorway, her cleaning cart forgotten behind her. The room was full of elegant people in expensive clothes, and she was still wearing her navy uniform with her grandmother's compass hanging next to a bottle of Windex. Henri saw her first. His eyes met hers across the room, and he nodded slightly, as if giving her permission for something she hadn't known she needed. Actually, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet room, I learned French from my grandmother, who was a professor of literature at St. Petersburg University. Pierre turned to face her, his face flushed with wine and anger. Excuse me. You said I probably learned French from Google Translate. I thought you might like to know that I also speak Russian, Italian, and German. My grandmother believed that education was something that couldn't be taken away, no matter what circumstances you found yourself in. A murmur ran through the crowd. Brad appeared at the edge of her vision, his face white with panic. Furthermore, Larissa continued, stepping fully into the room, if you'd like to discuss culture and sophistication, I'd be happy to share some thoughts on Bizet's Carmen, which I had the honor of performing in Paris several years ago. Pierre's mouth opened and closed like a fish. You're just a cleaning lady. I am a cleaning lady, Larissa agreed. I'm also a daughter, a granddaughter, a woman who has read Proust in the original French and can sing arias that would make you weep if you had the emotional capacity to understand them. The silence stretched taut as a wire. Then Henri began to clap, slowly, deliberately. Others joined him, tentatively at first, then with growing conviction. Would you sing for us? Henri asked. Larissa felt the familiar flutter of terror and exhilaration that preceded every performance. She looked around the room at the faces watching her, some curious, some skeptical, some openly hostile. Her hand found her grandmother's compass. North, she whispered to herself, remembering her babushka's words. When you forget which direction is home, she began softly, almost speaking the opening lines of L'amour est un oiseau rebelle. Her voice was rusty from disuse, uncertain. But as the melody took hold, as the words found their rhythm, something inside her unlocked. The sound that emerged was pure, powerful, heartbreaking. It filled the ballroom like water filling a vessel, reaching every corner, touching every surface. This wasn't the voice of a cleaning lady or a former music student. This was the voice of someone who had lived, who had lost, who had endured. When she finished, the silence was complete. Then Pierre, the drunk businessman who had mocked her, was crying, actual tears streaming down his face. Forgive me, he said, his voice thick. I did not know. Henri approached her slowly, as if afraid she might disappear. Why? He asked. Why are you here, cleaning bathrooms, when you can do this? Larissa looked down at her grandmother's compass, then back at the room full of people who were seeing her, really seeing her, for the first time in years. Because sometimes, she said, we forget which direction is home. The next morning, Brad called her into his office. He couldn't meet her eyes. Look, he said, what happened last night? It was impressive, okay? But this is a hotel, not a concert hall. I need to know you're still committed to your job here. I am committed to doing good work, Larissa replied. Always have been. Right, but the French guy, he's been asking questions about your schedule, about whether we'd consider Adjustments to your position. Brad's discomfort was palpable. I told him that's not how things work here. What kind of adjustments? Something about using your language skills. Maybe working with international guests. He shrugged. Above my pay grade, honestly. Henry found her during her afternoon break, sitting in the small courtyard behind the kitchen where the staff sometimes took their cigarette breaks. She was reading again, the same worn copy of Les Misérables. I spoke with your manager, he said. I know. He's not the most flexible person, is he? Larissa laughed, the sound surprising them both. Brad thinks the world operates like a flow chart. Input, process, output. People like me don't fit neatly into his categories. I have a proposition, Henry said. My company is opening a cultural exchange program between Chicago and Lyon. We need someone who speaks multiple languages, understands both American and European sensibilities, and can represent us at various events. And you think I'm qualified? I think you're overqualified. Henri sat on the concrete step beside her. The position would pay $70,000 a year to start, plus travel opportunities. But there's a condition. Larissa waited. You have to audition for the lyric opera. Whether you get in or not, you have to try. That night, she called her mother in Detroit for the first time in 3 months. Mama, do you remember my compass, the one Babushka gave me? Of course, darling. She said it would help you find your way home. I think I'm starting to understand what she meant. The audition was scheduled for a Saturday morning in November. Larissa stood outside the Civic Opera House, wearing her best dress and carrying her grandmother's compass in her purse instead of on her cleaning cart. The building looked different when you walked through the front entrance instead of the service door. Rosa had wished her luck, though her expression remained skeptical. Just remember, honey, even if this don't work out, you still got a job. Don't burn bridges you might need to cross again. But Maria, the young cleaner who still believed in possibilities, had hugged her fiercely. Show them what we already know, she'd whispered. The audition room was smaller than she'd expected, more intimate. 3 judges sat behind a folding table, their faces professionally neutral. The piano player smiled encouragingly. Whenever you're ready, said the woman in the center. Larissa closed her eyes and found her grandmother's voice in her memory. Language is the only treasure that cannot be stolen. But music, she realized, was language in its purest form. She sang Vici d'arte from Tosca, pouring 10 years of suppressed dreams into every note. When she finished, the silence felt different than it had in the hotel ballroom. This was the silence of evaluation, of possibility being weighed and measured. Thank you, said the center judge. We'll be in touch. Henri's job offer was real. She gave Brad 2 weeks' notice, and to his credit, he seemed genuinely happy for her, though she suspected he was mostly relieved not to have to deal with the complications her newfound visibility had created. On her last day at the Palmer House, she was cleaning the Gold Coast room one final time when she found Pierre waiting for her. He was sober, dressed in a beautiful suit, and carrying a small wrapped package. I wanted to apologize, he said. Properly. What I said that night was inexcusable. We all say things we don't mean when we're hurting, Larissa replied. He handed her the package. Inside was a first edition of Bizet's Carmen libretto, signed by the composer himself. I bought this at auction in Paris. It belongs with someone who understands its true value. 3 weeks later, the letter from the Lyric Opera arrived. She had been accepted into their Young Artist program, with a scholarship covering full tuition. Her hands shook as she read it twice, then called Henri. I told you gifts like yours don't disappear, he said. They just wait for the right moment to emerge. The following spring, Larissa stood on the stage of the Civic Opera House, wearing a costume that transformed her into Carmen herself. In the audience, she could see Henri sitting in the 3rd row, beaming with pride. Next to him sat Rosa and Maria, wearing their best dresses and looking slightly overwhelmed by the grandeur of their surroundings. But it was Brad's presence that surprised her most. He sat in the back, wearing a suit she'd never seen before, applauding enthusiastically during her curtain call. After the performance, as she signed programs in the lobby, a young girl approached her table. She was maybe 8 years old, clutching her mother's hand and staring at Larissa with wide eyes. Are you really Carmen? The girl asked. Larissa knelt down to meet her eyes. I'm someone who remembers that we all have music inside us. Sometimes we just need to be brave enough to let it out. The girl nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense. Later, alone in her dressing room, Larissa held her grandmother's compass. The small silver instrument caught the light from the vanity mirror, reflecting back fragments of brightness. She thought about directions, about the different ways a person could define home. Through the thin walls, she could hear the janitor emptying trash bins in the hallway, humming softly to himself as he worked. She opened her door and peeked out. He was a young man, maybe 25, wearing the same kind of navy uniform she used to wear. "That's a beautiful song," she said. He looked up, startled and embarrassed. "Sorry, I didn't know anyone was still here." "Don't apologize. Music should never be apologized for." She paused. "Do you sing professionally?" He laughed, but not with humor. "Lady, I empty trash for a living." Larissa stepped fully into the hallway, still wearing her Carmen costume, still holding her compass. "So did I until very recently." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of possibility he was afraid to acknowledge. "What's your name?" she asked. "Marcus." "Well, Marcus, would you like to know about some auditions coming up next month?" He stared at her for a long moment, then set down his trash bag. "Are you serious?" "Music finds a way," she said, echoing her grandmother's words. "Sometimes we just have to be brave enough to listen." As she walked out of the opera house that night, Larissa realized she no longer needed the compass to find her way home. Home wasn't a direction on a map. It was the moment when the world finally saw you for who you'd always been, and you had the courage to sing back. Behind her, she could hear Marcus humming as he finished his rounds, his voice growing stronger and more confident with each note. The sound followed her into the Chicago night, a promise that the cycle would continue, that hidden voices would find their way to the light. The compass in her purse had served its purpose. Tomorrow, she would give it to someone else who had forgotten which direction led home.